Many people know the basic stories of Prometheus, Pandora, and Persephone, but most people are less familiar with the complete versions of these stories, and most don't realize how closely they are tied to one another in Greek mythology. In addition, these stories raise troubling questions about the relationship between the gods and humanity that appear over and over again in Greek mythology. These stories, more than any others in Greek mythology, demonstrate how intertwined the fates of God and men are in ancient Greek thought. Prometheus' story goes back to the age of the Titans. Prometheus was actually one of the Titans, but in the great war between the Titans and the Olympic gods, he and his mother allied themselves with Zeus, rather than with Kronos and the other Titans. As a result, Zeus did not cast Prometheus into the depths of the underworld with the other Titans when they were finally defeated. According to Hesiod's Theogony, Prometheus later emerged on the scene at a sacrificial meal meant to celebrate the resolution of a conflict between humans and the gods. Prometheus brought 2 offerings from a slaughtered ox to that meal, and he devised a trick to fool Zeus, who was to receive the offering. One offering included the meat and the entrails, covered in the skin and the stomach of the ox. The other included the animal's bones, but wrapped in the animal's fat. Hesiod states that Prometheus allowed Zeus to choose which offering he wanted, declaring, "Very noble Zeus, greatest of the gods who are for always, choose whichever of these the spirit in your breast bids you." Zeus knew what Prometheus was up to. Hesiod writes, "Zeus, whose wisdom is everlasting, saw, and failed not to perceive the trick." But Zeus behaved as if he were to see, and he chose the bones covered in fat. Hesiod explains, "From then on, for the immortals, the tribes of men on earth burn white bones on fragrant altars." In other words, Zeus's choice determined that from that time forward, humans would make offerings of bones and fat to the gods, saving the meat and entrails for their own consumption. Hesiod explains that Zeus made his choice deliberately, with full knowledge that he was choosing the bones and the fat. Hesiod writes that Zeus was not ignorant of the cunning, but he eyed evils with his mind for mortal men that he intended to fulfill. In effect, Zeus played Prometheus, and he followed up with his own evil plan. As Hesiod wrote, "From this time, always mindful of his wrath, he would not give the strength of weariless fire to the ash trees for mortal men who dwell on earth." In other words, Zeus refused to allow humanity access to fire. In fact, speaking directly to mankind, Zeus declares, "You would easily do work enough in a day to supply you for a full year even without working. Soon would you put away your rudder over the smoke, and the fields worked by ox and sturdy mule would run to waste." It's worth pausing a moment to note the dynamics here. Human beings are really passive bystanders in this conflict. They're merely pawns in a battle of wits between Zeus and Prometheus. But as a result, humanity is left without a fundamental raw element of civilized life, fire. Prometheus refuses to let the situation remain this way. He steals fire and he gives it to humanity. According to Hesiod, Prometheus steals the far-seen beam of weariless fire in a hollow fennel stalk, and he delivers it to mankind. We're not given a clear motivation for this act. It may simply be that Prometheus felt that Zeus was punishing humanity inappropriately. Fire is an essential element in ancient Greek sacrifice, as well as in meat preparation. So by depriving humanity of fire, Zeus in effect stopped both sacrifice and meat eating. It's also interesting to note that many cultures include a story explaining how fire was given to humanity. The earliest Hindu text, the Rig Veda, describes how a character named Matar Ishvan brought fire down from heaven to human beings after it had been hidden from them. In the Creek Native American tradition, the archetypical figure rabbit stole fire from the weasels to give to humanity. And in the Book of Enoch, Azazel and the fallen angels teach ancient human beings how to use fire along with tools. Clearly, discovering fire was an important developmental moment in human history, and many ancient cultures marked this moment with an etiological or an origin story to explain it somehow. The story of Prometheus explains why human beings have to work so hard throughout their lives. It also suggests an interesting combination of pride and guilt about the use of fire as a tool. In Hesiod's account, Zeus punished Prometheus by chaining him to a mountain top. An eagle fed on Prometheus's liver each day, and the liver was regenerated each night, so his torment seemed endless. Prometheus was only saved from an eternity of this punishment by Heracles, albeit with the approval of Zeus, Heracles' father. The 5th century BCE dramatist Aeschylus presents a very different version of the Prometheus story in his play Prometheus Bound. In this play, Prometheus claims that Zeus intended to wipe out all of humanity, but Prometheus's efforts saved them from destruction. In addition, Prometheus lists all of the gifts he has given to humanity beyond the gift of fire. He includes reading and writing, mathematics, science, construction, especially building shelters and homes, shipbuilding, and the ability to read oracles in order to discern the will of the gods. Prometheus claims that with his gifts, he has made human culture possible. In effect, Aeschylus's version turns Hesiod's version on its ear. Hesiod's Prometheus is a troublemaker who offended the wise and just Zeus and brought hard labor into the human condition. Aeschylus presents Prometheus as a liberator, freeing humans from their dependence on the gods and from Zeus's tyranny in particular. In later Greek culture, Aeschylus's version wins out. Prometheus is praised for making human culture possible. And beyond that, Prometheus is associated with freedom from tyranny and other forms of political and moral autonomy. Notice that even though human beings are relatively passive in this story, the gods punish humanity as well as Prometheus when he gives them fire. The gods withdraw a measure of their support from normal mortals, and as a result, we are left to make our own way in the world. Thus, the story provides another etiology, another explanation for the origins of the rupture between the gods and humanity. In addition, the Prometheus story provides an etiology for animal sacrifice, the principal Greek religious act. Prometheus not only gives fire to humans, he also establishes animal sacrifice, and he determines exactly which elements humans will be required to give to the gods in sacrifice. From the Greek perspective, this is absolutely transformative. Sacrifice established a new way of relating to the gods. It engaged humanity with the gods at a new level, in a sense, forcing the gods to take humanity seriously. At the same time, the use of fire in sacrifice is a reminder that there's a rift, a distance between humanity and the gods. When you think about it, every time human beings offer Greek sacrifice, it includes fire, the one thing Zeus didn't want us to have. Thus, the act of sacrifice is a constant reminder of a changed relationship, a tension between the gods and humanity. It marks the rift between us. Sacrifice marks the physical differences between gods and humanity as well, highlighting our physical neediness and our fragility. Human beings require food. They need to consume animal flesh. But the gods don't need food for sustenance. Instead, they inhale the aroma of the sacrifice. On a metaphorical level, the gods are the objects of an act that acknowledges that humans have primal material needs. The gods do not. The act of sacrifice is a public acknowledgement that our share in this life is tied to our flesh. We experience hunger and pain and ultimately mortality. In sacrifice, the Greeks acknowledged that the gods were not subject to these same limitations. Under this interpretation, the element of fire plays a role in sacrifice to remind us of our own limits. One slightly cynical interpretation of the ancient Greek sacrificial system is that it conveniently assigned humans the portions of an animal's sacrifice that they could eat, leaving the less useful portions, like bones, to the gods. Understood in this way, men literally get to have their sacrifice and eat it too. Finally, sacrifice reminds the gods that humans have elevated themselves to some extent. As a result of Prometheus's gift, humans have technology and culture. Humans may submit religiously to the gods, but they are no longer wholly dependent upon the gods to move forward. There is an ongoing tension between the two, and while sacrificial acts may appease gods temporarily, sacrifice never completely removes the tension between gods and humanity. Despite the fact that Prometheus is credited with establishing sacrifice, he himself does not seem to have been the major focus of a cult in ancient Greece. He seems to have been associated with Athena and Hephaestus and worship at Athens. Together they were recognized as gods associated with creative skills. In contrast, Prometheus's relationship with non-Greek communities was in some cases quite significant, and almost as turbulent as his relationship with Zeus. For some, he acted as a kind of savior figure, bringing a limited gift of salvation and suffering for that gift. The Christian early church father Tertullian cast Prometheus as a kind of forerunner of Christ. He suggested that there was the promise of complete liberation that would only be fully given by Jesus. In doing this, Tertullian gave a nod to Greek thought as an important forerunner to Christianity, rather than simply pointing to Jewish thought. By the 17th century, the picture had changed a bit. John Milton modeled his Satan in Paradise Lost on Prometheus. And in the 18th century, Prometheus became a kind of patron saint for those rebelling against political and religious leaders. Just as he freed humanity from the tyranny of the gods, he inspired rebellion against tyrannical kings and priests. The story of Prometheus raises a theme that runs throughout Greek mythology: the tenuous, delicate relationship between humanity and the gods. This notion can be found in common folk tales such as Aesop's fables, as well as in the literary mythological traditions we've been discussing. There's a famous line in one of Aesop's fables: "The gods help those who help themselves." This little phrase sums up the fundamental dynamic between the Greek gods and humanity. In general, the Greek gods are just not particularly concerned with human beings. Mortals wander in and out of the gods' own dramas, like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet, wandering in and out of the prince's life. And like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, human beings are often seriously affected by the choices the gods make, but they remain largely secondary in the gods' minds. Our concerns are not necessarily the gods' concerns. Prometheus seems to be the exception to this rule. He manipulates the nature of sacrifice so that human beings get the good portions, and he brings fire to humanity, making high culture as well as basic survival possible. In other traditions recorded by Aesop, Ovid, and Apollodorus, Prometheus is actually credited with fashioning men from clay. He is literally hands-on when it comes to interacting with mankind. Now, remember that Prometheus was not, in fact, a god like Zeus and the other Olympians. Prometheus was a titan, in effect a remnant of the first generation of gods, the ones that preceded the Olympic gods. It may be that the ancient Greeks thought, or maybe hoped, that the very first generation of gods cared about humanity, in contrast to the detachment displayed by the Olympians. We've already noted that the story of Prometheus provides an etiology for several elements of human life. Well, there's one more etiology, one more explanation of origins that the Prometheus story provides. When Zeus punished Prometheus for giving fire to humanity, he also punished humanity in a very specific way. He sent Pandora, described as a beautiful evil. According to Hesiod, Zeus ordered Hephaestus, whom Hesiod calls the Lame One because he walked with a limp, to mold from Gaia a likeness of majestic maiden. Goddess gray-eyed Athena girded and dressed her in a silvery white garment. Hephaestus led her out to where the other gods and men were, her adorned in the garment the gray-eyed daughter of a mighty father. Wonder held immortal gods and mortal men when they saw a sheer cunning unmanageable for men, for from her is the descent of female women. Hesiod later explains that the name Pandora, meaning all gifts, comes from the fact that in making her, all they who dwelt on Olympus gave each a gift, a plague to men who eat bread. Now, I always had trouble with how Eve is characterized in the Bible, but this description of Pandora takes the cake. According to Hesiod, Pandora, the first woman, was designed expressly to be unmanageable for men. According to the myth, Hermes, messenger to the gods, brought Pandora to Prometheus's brother Epimetheus to be his bride. Despite Prometheus's warnings, Epimetheus, another titan, accepted Pandora as a gift from the gods. Of course, as we all know, Pandora brought a jar with her, a jar best known to us today as Pandora's box. Although she had been warned not to open the jar, her curiosity overcame her. When she opened it, she released into the world evils, harsh pain, and troubling diseases that give men death. In another version of the story, Pandora releases all good spirits, but they fly away from earth to heaven, completely abandoning humanity. In every version, only one spirit remains, hope, which is caught under the lid of the jar. We won't attempt to reconcile the jar full of evil spirits that also contains hope. Suffice it to say that a lot of scholarly ink has been spilled trying to figure out how hope relates to all the suffering and ills that were trapped in Pandora's jar. For our purposes, the key is that Pandora, the first human bride, is presented as the source of all mankind's suffering. In essence, Zeus created the institution of human marriage in giving Pandora to Epimetheus. And according to tradition, since Pandora's creation, men have had to choose between two imperfect options, either taking a woman into their lives and opening themselves to all the risks that this involves, or remaining single and therefore childless, left with no heir. Referencing Pandora, Hesiod states, Zeus, who thunders on high, made women to be an evil to mortal men, with a nature to do evil. Much like the biblical Eve, woman is the source of all suffering in the world. Man cannot live with her, and he cannot live without her. Most of the time, Pandora's story ends there, and this poor woman is vilified forever for bringing evil into the world. Never mind that Zeus was really behind everything. What is far less well known is that in Greek tradition, Pandora and Epimetheus bear a daughter, Pyrrha, who is described as the first naturally born human woman. Now Pyrrha marries Deucalion, the natural-born son of Prometheus. And Pyrrha and Deucalion are the only two humans to survive a great flood that comes upon the earth, riding it out in a boat and winding up on a mountaintop. Now, if that sounds familiar, It may be because this story, as well as the flood story in the Bible, were both influenced by ancient Mesopotamian myths that I explore in another Great Mythologies collection about the Middle East and South Asia. In any case, Purra and Deucalion repopulate the earth, but not in the way you might expect. Purra and Deucalion consult an oracle to obtain guidance about how to repopulate the earth with human beings, and the oracle instructs them to cast the bones of their mother over their shoulders. In response, Purra casts stones over her shoulder, and these stones become women. Deucalion casts stones over his shoulder, and these stones become men. The stones are the bones of their Mother Earth, and in this way the human race continues, literally as children of the earth. Note Pandora's role in all of this. We tend to associate Pandora with pain, with suffering and illness. But Pandora also gives birth to the first naturally born human woman. And it's because of this woman that humanity survives after the Great Flood. It seems only fair to give Pandora some credit for this positive contribution to our welfare, given all the grief she gets for opening that darn box. We talked in an earlier lecture about how the goddesses fare in Greek mythology, and Pandora's story is a perfect example of this. We have time for one more story, so let's turn to another familiar one, this time the story of Persephone. I referred to her briefly in the previous lecture, but let's take some time to review her full story now. Persephone was the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, a harvest goddess. Both Hermes and Apollo sought her hand in marriage, but her mother rejected them as unsuitable for her daughter. One day, when Persephone was alone in the fields, the god Hades emerged from the underworld through a great crevice in the ground. He kidnapped Persephone, carrying her to the underworld. When Demeter realized that her daughter Persephone was gone, she searched the whole earth looking for her. In some versions of this story, as she does this, she neglects her care for vegetation, and so nothing grows. In other versions, she actually commands the earth not to produce vegetation. Eventually, she discovers where Persephone has been taken, and she turns to Zeus for help. Zeus is pressured by Demeter to have Persephone returned. He also gets pressured to do something because during all this time, no vegetation has grown, so the people of the world are literally starving. Zeus travels to Hades and demands that Persephone be released. This is where the story really gets interesting. You would think that at this point, Hades would either refuse to hand Persephone over, fighting Zeus to keep her, or he'd simply release her. But instead, things get a little more complicated. Hades agrees to release Persephone, but as she's leaving, he tricks her into eating several pomegranate seeds. Usually the number listed is 4. For some reason, Persephone is required to spend 1 month each year in the underworld for each piece of food she has eaten while there. As a result, each year she spends 4 months in the underworld. During those months, Demeter grieves, the vegetation on Earth suffers, and we have winter. Clearly, this myth is another etiology designed to explain why we experience the seasons and why vegetation flourishes at certain times of the year and not at others. But when you think about it, there is no logical reason why eating 4 pomegranate seeds ought to mean that Persephone has to spend 4 months in the underworld. The mythology itself simply states that the fates had decreed that anyone who ate food in the underworld was required to stay there. Several explanations have been offered for this. One explanation is that vegetation is linked to eating, and since Persephone eats something in the underworld, the upper world loses the ability to eat as a result. It's an issue of balance. What happens in the underworld has repercussions above ground. Some of the more interesting interpretations are less obvious, and they probably tell us more about Greek culture. When Persephone eats, even if she's been tricked into it, she is accepting Hades' hospitality. Now, in the ancient world, this is tantamount to agreeing to come under someone's protection. And given the fact that Persephone and her mother had rejected proposals from other gods, the god Hades could make the case that in the eyes of society, Persephone changed from being a captive at the moment that she ate into being a guest when she accepted food from his table. This rationale may seem a bit forced to us in the modern time period, but it would have been somewhat more reasonable to an audience that emphasized the dynamics of hospitality as a way of survival. In addition, the fact that Persephone eats from a pomegranate is symbolic. Pomegranates symbolized abundance in various forms. In addition to being associated with hospitality, pomegranates were thus linked to sexual fertility as well. One could interpret the mythological moment of Persephone eating the pomegranate seeds as a metaphor for submitting sexually to Hades. In that case, under the social mores of the ancient world, Hades had every right to assert some kind of continuing relationship with her. A blunter interpretation is that the story of Hades sneaking seeds into Persephone's mouth is a pretty straightforward metaphor for rape, or, at least, seduction. Once Persephone had received Hades' seeds, that is, had had intercourse with him, voluntarily or not, she would no longer be a virgin. And in the ancient world, this pretty much meant she wouldn't be sought after as a wife by any other god. Persephone, in effect, was taken as a wife in ways that offend modern sensibilities, but in a way that met the ancient Greek mythological and social code. For the record, the Greeks weren't the only ones to approach marriage this way. Other ancient texts, and I can think of ancient Hindu social codes, allowed men to obtain wives in ways that cause us to shudder today, but were absolutely acceptable at that time. Because of her mythology, Persephone becomes understood as a vegetation goddess. This makes sense. She also becomes known as the goddess of the underworld, and she's even called the goddess of death in some accounts. Most notably, Persephone was worshipped along with her mother in the Eleusinian Mysteries, an annual fall festival in Eleusis. Now, the term mysteries in this context refers to secret rituals open only to those who had been initiated into specific cults of worship. The Eleusinian Mysteries became the most important festival in Greek culture, and it was eventually taken up by the Romans when they conquered Greece. This festival dramatized Persephone's story in a three-phase ritual, broken down into descent, the search, and the ascent phases, culminating in Persephone's rise from the underworld and her reunion with Demeter, her mother. The festival was focused on generating new life, both for vegetation, but also for initiates, who participated in the Eleusinian mystery cult. There were two forms of the Eleusinian mysteries, the lesser and the greater. The lesser mysteries were relatively simple, involving ritual purification of initiates and an animal sacrifice. You had to complete the lesser mysteries in order to participate in the greater mysteries. The greater mysteries were much more complicated, lasting 10 full days. The rituals involved a ritual purification in the sea and a procession from the temple to Demeter in Athens to the city of Eleusis, which was about 18 kilometers northwest of Athens. In Eleusis, a period of fasting was followed by a special drink. Then those with a special initiation could enter the Telesterion, the great hall in Eleusis and a center for the Eleusinian mystery ceremonies. There, the initiates would observe the secret rituals. It was absolutely forbidden to describe what was seen and done during these rituals, so even to this day we don't really know. The festival ended with a night-long celebration, along with the sacrifice of a bull and libation offerings to the dead. The Eleusinian mysteries and the figures of Persephone and Demeter probably have roots in older agricultural cults and goddesses. Some scholars have linked the Eleusinian mysteries with similar cult rituals associated with the Egyptian gods Isis and Osiris, who was also brought back from the dead. In both cases, the focus seems to have been on immortality or resurrection after death. Both Persephone and Osiris' stories involve regeneration and draw the audience's attention to issues of birth, death, and renewal. I began this lecture by noting that each of these myths describes gods acting in a way that connect intimately with the general human experience. Their actions don't just affect a few human beings, but humanity as a whole. Their stories give expression to aspects of life that every human being deals with. Prometheus gave fire to humans, which makes both civilization and worship of the gods possible. Pandora introduced every kind of evil into the world, but she's also credited with holding on to hope, making it possible for humanity to face evil and suffering with some kind of optimism for the future. Finally, Persephone introduces the seasons, shaping the agricultural cycle. In a world without Kroger or refrigeration, food availability was closely tied to the seasons. Persephone's story is the story of hunger and plenty. At another level, Persephone's story is also about human life and death. She, alone of all the gods, goddesses, and mortals, experiences life, a descent into the underworld, and then restoration to the land of the living on a regular basis. She embodies the cycle of life and death. The worship cult that developed around her promised spiritual and possibly physical immortality through its secret rituals. Virtually every mythological tradition we know offers immortality in some form, either physical or spiritual, even if only in the form of great deeds long remembered. And individual gods who return to this world after death or who experience resurrection tend to attract worshippers. Think of the Christian god or Osiris, for example. Interest in some kind of life after death seems virtually universal in world mythology, and worship cults tend to grow around individual gods who can offer life after death. In the stories of Prometheus, Pandora, and Persephone, the ancient Greeks explored the foundational elements of human life: life, death, food, fire, life's blessings and curses, and they tied these basic elements of human experience to the gods. In so doing, they made the myths of the gods absolutely integral to ordinary human experience. In the next two lectures, we'll see that they also took this intimate relationship with the gods a step further by linking the gods to extraordinary human experiences. The Greek myths treat heroes differently from mere mortals. Heroes are so important to Greek mythology that they even have their own distinct creation story. In the last lecture, we explored how Prometheus, at least according to some ancient authorities, created mankind out of clay. According to other traditions, however, it was Zeus who created humanity, and in fact he did it himself multiple times, with each successive creation being worse than the previous one. Zeus began with the Golden Age, followed by the Silver Age, then the Bronze Age, and then the Age of the Heroes. He ended with the Iron Age, the age in which human beings as we know them are created. The heroes then were created as man was about to come into the world in his most degraded form. And so the heroes offer a hopeful alternative. There are several classically recognized Greek heroes. Heracles and Odysseus are the best known. We'll talk about Odysseus in our next lecture, so in this one, let's focus on Heracles. The scholar Walter Burkert describes Heracles, better known to most of us by his Roman name Hercules, as the most popular of Greek heroes to modern audiences. Heracles was born as the result of an affair between Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene. As a result, Heracles was half god and half man. Hera, Zeus's wife, hated Heracles because he was a constant reminder of Zeus's infidelity, and Hera expends a great deal of energy making Heracles' life miserable. First, she tries to actually stop his birth. Then, she tries to prevent him from becoming the High King of Mycenae, establishing King Eurystheus as king instead. And finally, Hera induces Heracles to kill his own children, and in some versions of the story, his wife. However, Heracles is protected by another goddess, Athena, Zeus's daughter and Heracles' half-sister, so Hera is never quite able to defeat him. Ultimately, Heracles is given immortality, and he achieves status as a god. According to legend, while Heracles was a young man herding cattle on a mountainside, he was given a choice by two nymphs named Pleasure and Virtue. They offer him a choice between an easy but an unremarkable life, or a hard but a glorious life. Of course, he's a hero, so he chooses glory. This is a classic hero move. Heroes in Greek mythology live big, always willing to risk death and hardship in order to face challenges. This doesn't mean that heroes are perfect. In fact, part of their appeal is that they are deeply flawed. Heracles, thrown into madness by the goddess Hera, murders his own family. And once he comes to his senses, he becomes desperate, looking for some way to atone for their deaths. The best-known stories about Heracles center on the work he does to atone for these murders, the 12 labors of Heracles. These labors are described in several texts, but the first record we have of a fixed collection of 12 labors seems to have appeared in an epic poem around 600 BCE, but that poem is now lost to us. According to the various story traditions, when Heracles realizes that he has murdered his family, he runs to the Oracle of Delphi, and he begs for a way to atone for his crimes. Again, this is another hallmark of the hero figure. He's a man who takes responsibility for his misdeeds, and he translates that responsibility into some kind of action. The Oracle, guided by Hera, instructs Heracles to serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae, the man who took the throne that Heracles should have occupied. Heracles is directed to serve this king for 10 full years, fulfilling whatever task the king sets before him. Heracles initially is reluctant to do this because of the history between the two men. Any service that Heracles performs for Eurystheus, therefore, is publicly humiliating, as well as physically demanding and dangerous. However, Heracles eventually agrees. King Eurystheus takes advantage of this opportunity. The king originally devises 10 tasks for Heracles to perform, but he ends up refusing to accept Heracles' efforts in 2 of them. As a result, the king requires 2 more tasks, and after completing the last task, King Eurystheus releases Heracles from service. In addition, Heracles receives immortality. Now, no single literary source describes all of the Herculean tasks. However, all 12 labors are depicted on the carved panels known as metopes on the Temple of Zeus in Olympia. Scholars reference this temple to argue that the 12 labors mythology must have been fairly well fixed by the mid-5th century BCE, since the temple, which is dated to around 450 BCE, records all of these labors. There is some dispute as to the sequence of the 12 labors, but traditionally they occurred as follows. First, Heracles slew the Nemean lion. Then, he killed the multi-headed Hydra. Third, he caught the golden hind of Artemis. Fourth, he caught the Erymanthian boar. Fifth, he cleaned the Augean stables in a single day. Sixth, he killed the Stymphalian birds. Seventh, he captured the bull of Crete. Eighth, he stole the mares of Diomedes. Ninth, he took the girdle of Hippolyta, who was queen of the Amazons. And 10th, he stole the cattle of Geryon the giant. Eurystheus rejected Heracles' efforts in 2 of these tasks. He rejected the killing of the Hydra because Heracles' nephew helped him. The king also rejected the cleaning of the stables. In some accounts, the king rejects this work because Heracles received payment for the work. In other accounts, the king claims that the rivers that Heracles diverted in order to flush out the stables actually did all the real work. As a result of the king's objections, Heracles performs 2 more tasks. He steals the apples of Hesperides with the help of Atlas, and he captures Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who guards the entrance to the underworld. We don't have time to review each of these labors in detail, but it will be useful to examine a few of them to note some common elements that run throughout the entire series. In the first labor, Heracles is sent to slay a lion, but this is no ordinary lion. The Nemean lion has been terrorizing an entire town, luring young warriors into his lair, and then devouring them. This lion has golden fur that is impervious to arrows. In some versions of the story, Heracles manages to shoot an arrow directly into the lion's mouth, which is not protected. In other versions, Heracles actually strangles the lion to death. After killing the lion, he skins the animal, but he can't remove the skin with an ordinary knife. So the goddess Athena directs him to use the lion's own claw to remove the hide. When Heracles returns to King Eurystheus with the Nemean lion's hide, the king is not only impressed, he's actually a little bit terrified. He begins to understand Heracles' strength. The king forbids Heracles from ever coming into the city again. Instead, he is ordered to present the evidence of his labors outside the city gates, and in some versions, the king never meets personally with Heracles again. Instead, he uses a go-between to communicate the tasks. This is a classic Labors of Heracles story, and a classic hero myth. First, it involves a seemingly impossible task, the defeat of a creature with extraordinary powers. In the lion's case, the impenetrable fur renders the usual means of attack useless. From a mythological point of view, this means that Heracles, our hero, must demonstrate extraordinary abilities himself in order to triumph. In defeating the lion, he demonstrates several key qualities. First, he's fearless. Heracles, like all good heroes, steps into situations where others have perished. The targets of the labors are special. They are monsters, royal rulers, or divine creatures with special powers or protections. The assigned tasks all present special challenges in which Heracles risks his life. Second, our hero exhibits extraordinary strength. Heracles in particular is known for his brute strength, but in general, heroes are stronger and more skillful than other men. Third, Heracles is clever. Strength isn't enough to kill the Nemean lion. Heracles has to develop a strategy for attacking the lion in a new way, unlike the warriors who have attacked in the past. Different versions of this story present different strategies, but every version demonstrates Heracles' clever thinking. Finally, Heracles has divine assistance. The heroes of Greek myths have gods watching over them. Heracles is Zeus's son, so he's got some help there. But in the story of the Nemean lion, Athena the goddess also steps in to tell Heracles how to skin the lion. It's worth revisiting here the divine help that Heracles gets in accomplishing these tasks. As we've seen before, the gods and goddesses only selectively intervene in ordinary human affairs. They seem to have a greater stake in the affairs of heroes, however. In Heracles' case, it's like taking sides in an extended family squabble. If you side with Heracles, you automatically pit yourself against Hera. I tend to think that a story like this one reflects our own human desire to be the center of attention, even on a divine stage. After all, it's a measure of how important you are to see how many gods and goddesses will drop what they are doing and come to your aid. But again, only heroes and kings warrant this kind of attention. Most of us mere mortals do not. It's clear that no ordinary man could have fulfilled the task that King Eurystheus set for Heracles. So when Heracles returns, not only alive, but actually triumphant, the king has good reason to fear for himself and for his throne. He realizes that Heracles must be superhuman to have defeated that particular lion. And from that point forward, he makes Heracles' tasks more and more difficult. But this only makes Heracles appear increasingly powerful. In the second labor, Heracles must kill a multi-headed hydra. The problem is, whenever you cut off one of her heads, two more grow back. Heracles enlists his nephew's help, and together they use a firebrand to cauterize the wounds caused just after a head is cut off, making it impossible for a new head to grow. Heracles then uses a golden sword given to him by Athena to cut off the critical head of a hydra, and she dies. Again, Heracles demonstrates fearlessness, great strength, strategic thinking, and a key relationship with the gods. Some of the tasks Heracles takes on do not involve a dangerous monster. In the fifth labor, Heracles is sent to clean the Augean stables. Scholars note that by this time, King Eurystheus is really frustrated, so he's trying to humiliate Heracles as well as give him an impossible task. The king insults Heracles by making him clean out manure, in effect treating him like a lowly stable boy. The stables hold over 1,000 cattle, and these stables had not been cleaned in 30 years, so the sheer size of the task adds insult to injury. Finally, Heracles is given only 1 day to clean all the stalls. It seems an impossible task, so the king has set up Heracles to fail in the most humiliating context possible. Amazingly enough, Heracles succeeds. He reroutes the Alpheus and Peneus rivers, which carry away all the accumulated dung. However, King Eurystheus refuses to acknowledge Heracles' efforts in this task, arguing that the rivers did all the real dirty work. In addition, the king notes that Heracles received payment from Aegeus' son for this task, so it shouldn't be counted toward his tasks for the king. The rest of the labors are very much like the ones we've described so far, seemingly impossible tasks designed to make Heracles fail on a very public stage. Instead, Heracles becomes increasingly impressive. In his last labor, Heracles enters and leaves the underworld alive with divine assistance. He defeats Cerberus, the hound of hell, and he lays the beast at King Eurystheus' feet. The fact that Heracles has walked into the underworld and emerged unscathed so terrifies the king that he offers to stop assigning labors if Heracles will just take the beast back to the underworld. And thus the labors of Heracles come to an end. It seems fitting to me that Heracles' tasks end with a task in the underworld. We'll see next time that another hero, Odysseus, also journeys to the underworld. The journey to the realm of the dead is a classic hallmark of heroes' lives. The trip to the underworld acts as a metaphor for a kind of death to self. In Heracles' case, a task in the realm of the dead serves as the final step toward atoning for the murders he's committed, and to secure his own immortality. Heracles walks through the land of the dead, and he's resurrected to lead a new life. After his 12 labors, Heracles joins Jason and the Argonauts on their quest for the Golden Fleece. In this journey, Hera manages to drive Heracles mad once again, and he throws Odysseus' best friend, Iphitus, over a wall, killing him. Again, Heracles seeks atonement through servitude. Eventually, Heracles is killed when his wife gives him a deadly tunic to wear. She has heard that he's been blundering, fooling around on her, and she's been told that this particular tunic will excite the love of her husband for her. In reality, the tunic has been smeared on the inside with the blood of the Hydra, or in other versions, the blood of the centaur Nessus. This blood acts as a poison, burning Heracles' flesh when he puts the tunic on. His mortal body is literally burned away, but he's left with an immortal form. Heracles is transformed, and he rises to Olympus as he dies, now an immortal god. Given Heracles' popularity, both in ancient Greece and in modern times, we should take some time now to ask, what does this specific hero figure tell us about Greek culture and values? Perhaps most surprisingly, the Heracles hero figure is imperfect. Heracles is known for being wild and unkempt. It's worth noting that in the 6th century BCE, Heracles became the patron of the Cynics, a group of philosophers who encouraged a retreat into a kind of pre-civilization wilderness, removing themselves from the current social, cultural, and political world. Instead, the Cynics advocated living at the margins of human society, denying themselves the basic comforts of civilized living, choosing to live in the forests, and sometimes dressing in animal skins. Heracles is also known for having a voracious appetite for sex, for wine, and for food, often leading to horrible results. His fooling around eventually leads to his mortal death. His wife gives him the tunic, smeared in blood specifically in response to his cheating. Note that his wife's name, Deianira, literally means manslaughterer. This alone should have given him a clue. You could say that Heracles brought his painful death upon himself. However, Heracles is not Dionysus. His wild indulgences in sex, food, and drink are offset by acts of extreme self-denial. This, I would argue, is the key to Heracles' importance in Greek culture. While Heracles is clearly a flawed man who does some appalling things, he always atones for his misdeeds. He sets his world in order. In the process, he sets the world in order for others. He defeats monsters that threaten individuals and communities with his physical strengths and his clever thinking. And he fathers families who, as it turns out, come to rule over various Greek city-states. Some have argued that the rampant philandering that the gods and Heracles engage in reflects a certain Greek appreciation for sexual prowess. For example, Heracles is known for sleeping with all 50 of Thespius' daughters in one night. However, we need to look a little bit deeper to understand this. Scholar John M. Bell argued that this story, and others like it, was less about sexual prowess or loose morals to the ancient Greeks, and more about ancestry. He knows that if Heracles slept with 50 women, and they all bore him children, then all of those descendants could claim Heracles as an ancestor. This kind of an ancestry has its social and political advantages, and Bell argues that that is the real point of the myth. He says, a whole vast, interconnected set of families is laying claim to descent from Heracles, and that has political implications. Other evidence supports Bell's theory. The Spartan royal system, for example, required that all their kings be descendants of Heracles. Heracles is distinct from other heroes in one more important way. He is the only figure in Greek mythology to be worshipped as both a mortal hero and as a god. In ancient Greece, the gods received sacrificial offerings in some kind of ritualized fashion. Mortals did not. Mortals may have received gifts in recognition of their achievements, but only the gods received sacrifices. Now, Heracles received both gifts appropriate to earthly heroes, and he also received altar-based goat or lamb sacrifices. And the ancient Greeks celebrated Heracleia, an annual festival that commemorated Heracles' death. While multiple shrines were erected to him throughout ancient Greece, his primary cult was in Thebes, where he was said to have been born. The most important of the Heracleia festivals were held there, and they included athletic games, musical competitions, and ritual sacrifices. These activities all reflect Heracles' own mythology, including his elevation to the status of a god. In addition, Heracles was known as a protector of the military. For example, the Thebans credited Heracles with helping win their war against the region of Phocis, and they made offerings to him as a result. Heracles was also worshipped as a protector of athletic events, growing out of his own physical strengths. He's considered one of the mythological founders of the Olympic Games. According to Pindar, Heracles fought Aegeus and defeated him. After that, Heracles then marked out the actual boundaries of the Altis, the sanctuary to Zeus in Greece's Peloponnese. Heracles is said to have established the Olympic Games there in honor of Zeus, as his father and as the supreme god. In one explanation of the original foot race run during the Olympics, Heracles is also credited with establishing the distance of that race by placing one foot in front of another 600 times. And finally, Heracles is said to have planted the olive tree from which the Olympic victors' crowns were formed. There are also worship practices surrounding Heracles that focus on less dramatic aspects of his life. These practices are interesting because some of them include elements that preserve mythology beyond the 12 labors. A cult, a worship community at Lindos, on the island of Rhodes, required that a plow ox be sacrificed and eaten in Heracles' name, and that the sacrificial ritual specifically included words of ridicule. This was said to be based on Heracles' own life. He arrived at Lindos hungry, so he butchered and ate an ox. The farmers who saw this hurled harsh words at him. Heracles actually was said to have enjoyed this, so he encouraged ridicule and verbal abuse in his own worship. In rituals at Antimachia on the island of Kos, the priest who supervised the Heracles cult was actually required to wear women's clothing. This is explained by a myth in which Heracles hid from his enemies under a woman's cloak. Heracles then allegedly ordered his devotees to commemorate this incident by having his male priest wear women's dress. There are two ways to understand the relationship between the cultic practices and the myths here. One is a fairly traditional argument, which maintains that the events described in the myths actually occurred, and they constitute the origins of the cultic practice that occurs. In this view, the rituals, in a sense, archive the mythology. Another approach is to argue that the myths were developed alongside or even after the cultic practices as post-dated justifications for specific ritual activities. We have no way of knowing the chronology for certain. Why do the stories of Heracles continue to appeal to modern listeners? Scholars point to the fact that the 12 Labors mythology follows a typical hero quest pattern in world mythology. the hero experiences some hardship or personal crisis that requires him to set out on a quest. This idea of the hero's journey can be traced back to the scholar Joseph Campbell, who argued that hero characters throughout worldwide mythology follow similar paths in their quests, with similar stages in these paths. According to Campbell, the hero's quest is always more than a simple geographic journey, and it involves more than accomplishing an external task. In the process of pursuing a tangible goal, the hero experiences an inner transformation. At the end of the quest, when he returns home, the hero has not only successfully met the physical challenge, he's changed as a person, and he's matured as a man. John M. Bell, a scholar of Greek mythology, ties the quest element in myth to the Greek appreciation for agonism or competition. The reward for the competition involved in a quest is the establishment or the revelation of one's true identity. This is true, Bell argues, whether it's a competition with the gods, with monsters, or with human opponents, and sometimes even with your own inner nature. Competition couched in the mythology of a quest acts as a crucible, purging the dross, crystallizing the hero's identity in his own mind, and ultimately in the eyes of the world. The Heracles hero stories invite comparisons with mythologies and other traditions. Some scholars note parallels to the Mesopotamian god Ninurta, who appears in an ancient Sumerian Akkadian text, and he fights 12 monsters, including a wild bull or a bison, a stag, the Anzu bird, a lion, and a 7-headed serpent. Heracles has also been compared to Shiva, a major deity in Hinduism, who also is known for wearing animal skin, carrying weapons, and leading a wandering nomadic life. Both Heracles and Shiva participate in civilization, but they actually live on the margins of society, and they both have uncivilized, destructive aspects to their personalities. The ancient Greek heroes like Heracles are created for physical exertion, usually for battle, with a moral dimension to their efforts. They are the supermen of Greek mythology. Not only are they physically strong, they usually also have one divine parent, which makes them not quite gods themselves, but godlike in their abilities. As a result, heroes can often succeed where others have failed. In addition, they are for the most part morally upright, although they are by no means perfect. As we've seen, Heracles fails big time, slaughtering his own children. When heroes fail, they fail big, so their failures can be catastrophic for other folks as well. On balance, however, over their lifetimes, heroes' good deeds outweigh their bad deeds, so they have a positive reputation in Greek mythology. Being special, however, has its downside. Heroes don't fit easily into the normal mortal world. They are marginalized figures. They don't tend to settle in one place. Instead, they are often on the move, traveling on quests to strange and dangerous places. The hero also lives in metaphorical, marginal places. He doesn't live a settled family life. Instead, he's constantly battling demons in his own mind, or dealing with the consequences brought about by his own character and choices. Superhuman physical strength can cause problems, especially when the hero loses control of that strength. And heroes tend to be subject to fits of anger. All in all, the life of a hero is difficult, and that is precisely what makes him a great mythological character. Heracles isn't the only hero in Greek mythology. Next time, we'll look at Odysseus, who has also been described as a hero. But Heracles is the ultimate example of a classic Greek hero. He manages to uphold traditional Greek values while not living a traditional Greek life. He travels to dangerous and exotic places, perhaps reflecting the Greeks' fascination with foreign lands and cultures. He struggles personally, but he manages to triumph over his struggles and to emerge from them a more mature person. And that part of the hero's journey speaks to us all.